All right, everyone. So thank you for joining us for episode 2 of Cerna Podcast Live. This is the monthly series where Cerna's team of experts and other special guests talk about all things ServiceNow. And this week we are tackling ServiceNow platform governance. And the reason why we wanted to handle that topic is because this is something that we hear from a lot of our customers and a lot of other organizations like yours, that it's harder than it looks, harder than it seems when you first get started. And sometimes it doesn't always go the way you plan. So we want to talk a little bit more about how to approach planning for this and what to do once you've actually gotten it started. How do you maintain that process? So we are joined by our panel of experts. I'll go ahead and let you guys introduce yourselves, starting with John. Why don't you go ahead and give us your name, tell us what you do for Cerna, where you live, and what would you be talking about if you weren't talking about ServiceNow? Sure.
So my name is John Lamberta. I'm the manager of consulting services, so kind of our general consulting practice manager here at Cerna. I'm based out of the Minneapolis-St. Paul area in Minnesota, although technically I'm on the Wisconsin side. When I'm not talking about ServiceNow, usually talking with people about DIY electronics builds, particularly synthesizers, drum machines, things like that. Making things to make music.
That's very cool. How many synthesizers have you made?
Hundreds. A lot of them are small modules. I have a wall-sized modular.
That's really cool.
Wires, so.
Okay.
Maybe next time, just from down in that room.
Yeah, that'd be fun. All right, Sabrina, you're next.
Yeah, hi, I'm Sabrina Ethridge. I'm a technical architect at Cerna, and I'm outside of the Chicago area in the northwest suburbs. And if I'm not talking about ServiceNow, I'm yelling at the invisible kid in my house that, didn't do something. Like this morning when somebody tried to disable parental controls on the switch before 7 a.m. So, but it wasn't any kid in my house.
Oh, good.
Wait, they disabled the controls on what?
What was that, Tim?
I didn't hear you. The kid disabled the controls on what was it?
The Switch, Nintendo Switch this morning.
Oh,
before 7 a.m. Lovely way to start the day.
All right, and Josh?
Yeah, Josh Tessaro. I'm the Security and Integrations Practice Manager at Cerna. So, responsible for security operations, integrations, custom apps, etc. I am located north of San Diego, so, in the suburbs up in Carlsbad. And when I'm not talking about ServiceNow or work in general, probably talking about my next outdoor activity. So I like hiking and various water activities quite a bit. So snorkeling, scuba diving, just always trying to plan what's next.
Did you hike when you? I know you've been in California for a short period now. Were you hiking before that, or is that something you picked up in California?
So I was hiking before that, not as much. I also lived in a mostly landlocked city, so the water activities were more limited as well. But it was a much bigger planning, a much more planned type of thing, right? You couldn't do it every weekend. You had to plan trips and stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, well, let's go ahead and get started. To let everyone know, this is going to be largely discussion-based, but we want you to be involved in the discussion. There is a questions panel on your GoToWebinar control panel. If you guys want to open up that module and ask questions throughout, don't hesitate. Don't wait until the end, because we would really like to try and incorporate any questions you have as soon into our conversation as possible. So definitely, as soon as it pops in your head, go in there and let us know. One question that happens quite often is this going to be recorded? Is this going to be somewhere where I can access it later? Obviously, this is a podcast or a video podcast. So the intention here is that we will not only be sending this to everyone who's registered for the event, but we will also be posting this on YouTube and our website as well. So anytime you guys want to come back and listen again or share with friends, we'd greatly appreciate that. So to just give you a little bit more idea of the format, we're going to be talking with our panel about a few topics about platform governance. We're going to be talking about what it is. We're going to set up some terms there. We're going to be discussing some strategy, and by the end, we're actually going to be doing a live kind of a whiteboard session or a kind of a mock whiteboard session, so you can see what our process is there on a more visual level, and hopefully be able to take something back to your organization if that's what you guys are looking to do. But let's jump to our first topic right now. So what do we mean specifically by platform governance? Now, I understand that this is a term that may have multiple different connotations across different organizations. Who wants to kind of approach that first? Okay, John, you approach that first.
Sure. So platform governance, I think it can mean a few different things, which is why I think it's potentially harder than it looks, because people aren't always on the same page talking about the same thing. I think as a developer, one of the first things that comes to mind is technical governance, coding best practices, things like that. I think if from a process analyst perspective, it may be process best practices. How do you best govern that you're following ITSM or ITIL, things like that. Or in the ServiceNow space, a lot of times what we really intend is how do we govern and control what's on the platform, what changes we're making to it, and what makes it in. And I think that's one of the more valuable types of governance that you can put in place.
Yeah, I think it's all the things you mentioned, and if I were to sum it up, it's how do you plan, control, and normalize all of the work being done on ServiceNow. So, that's the technical implementation work, that's the activities people are performing as part of, some type of departmental work, et cetera. How do we make sure that we have an eye on everything, and we have, we're handling things in a consistent way that's maintainable and supportable.
Agreed. And it's easy to cross conversations over, and that's why it's important to focus, make sure you know which one you're talking about when you have these conversations.
Now, I mean, how when someone takes on ServiceNow, obviously they're excited because it's a powerful tool, right? It can do a lot of versatile things, and I think that kind of what I brought up in the beginning, it's surprising how hard it is to manage this effectively. What do you think is the main component for you, and where have you seen that in some of the other companies that you've been working with?
You mean, why is it hard?
Yeah, essentially.
Yeah, I mean, I think people get really excited, right? You jump into your first implementation, ServiceNow's new to you, and you really do hit the ground running. ServiceNow encourages you to sort of just stack up a backlog and start doing work. And, that's a great way to get implemented fast, but I think we've skipped at that point past the governance conversation, right? How do we prioritize? How do we assess what we're going to do? And then once we know the things that we're going to do in the platform, how do we make sure that we're following platform and technical best practices? So people sort of, get into it, and they're already on the platform, and they're using it, and they've got things moving, and they're trying to make changes, and they haven't even had the discussion.
Okay.
Right, and especially it's important as you grow to grow that process with you. Because if you start out with getting the ground running with 1-2 developers and a small team, and as you put more things in, you've got to grow your governance strategy as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's all about being planful with what you're doing rather than just chasing the shiny balls and doing whatever kind of comes to top of mind or somebody comes up with a new idea or sees something new and immediately wants to implement it. You've got to be careful and be planful about what you're doing.
What are some examples that you guys have seen where there was a company that either was not really considering their governance, they didn't really have a governance strategy, or maybe they were not approaching it effectively? Sabrina, I'll shoot this to you.
Yeah, so I think 2 examples come to mind, and one is when you take off key components of governance, you try to automate things that really need people. So governance, you can't manage your platform just all through automation and trying to define rules that systematically determine what you're going to do and not do. You have to have a key person, or you have to have people involved in those discussions. And the other part is not doing the crawl, walk, run approach, making sure that, evolving your process as you're growing, as you're adding to the platform, trying to stay with the process that you used when you first rolled out versus, 4 years later when you've got a dozen more applications on the system, you've got a mismatch of size there.
I think adding on to your first point, Sabrina, I think you can go too far in the opposite direction too, and forcing everything through a governance process and making people review every change and kind of losing sight of what that governance process is really intended for.
Right. Yeah, you don't want your governance team to have to approve group name changes, basic stuff, right?
I think one of the things people have trouble with, right, is they sort of lose sight of the sort of platform process governance, and they get really focused on technical. And it's really hard to write, to Sabrina's point with the automation, right? It's really hard to write rules or policies around how things should be done technically or handled on the system when there's such variation across the applications. But yeah, so Tim, you asked about customers that had a bad experience, right, or did not abide by governance and had a negative result, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think I've seen people have to re-implement because they had an extended period of time where they basically, a new department came on and that department wanted to do things their own way, and they let them, do their own thing. So you get 3 or 4 departments on one instance doing whatever they want to do. And before you've got things implemented 3 different ways, 3 different places, and it's impossible to maintain.
Or multiple instances and double the licenses for the same base of users.
Yeah, so is that something that you guys see is kind of, obviously that's not an ideal situation, having multiple instances. Is that something you guys have seen other companies who just didn't quite know how to manage the platform or didn't have a proper strategy in place have to do?
A lot of times it comes down to not having the process in place and not communicated well, so that there's a lack of communication between groups, or the conversations aren't happening quickly enough for, somebody who has a strong business needs to get something in, and the door's kind of shut before they even get there, or even worse, they don't even know that a door exists.
Yep. Yeah, so I've seen customers, who don't have ServiceNow, and they, spontaneously a bunch of different groups start talking to ServiceNow, and they end up with a couple instances, or it happens through acquisition, but that's also a governance challenge, right? Or maybe it is. Maybe part of the acquisition process needs to be, what are existing apps do we need to onboard those things?
Sure. Okay, well, so let's kind of take this to the next step now. Let's say that, we've identified what are some problems that people have. Why is platform governance something that's a little bit more difficult for some companies? What do we do now? How do we approach planning for platform governance in an organization? Or what advice do you have for someone that's looking to do that?
I think number one, start with the people. So you have to identify who the key stakeholders are that you need to get involved and what roles they're going to be playing in platform governance, and that needs to start happening at least before you even think about what the process or technical mechanisms might be for it.
Do you guys feel like that's maybe the most commonly overlooked step, is sort of knowing how to incorporate the right people in the process?
Yeah, I think lots of companies end up with like the ServiceNow development team being involved in the platform governance, let's call it committee, right, or the people that help drive those decisions. And a lot of times, you do need a representative from the the sort of technical side, right? The expertise to guide and provide insight, but those aren't really the stakeholders. I think John's talking about, if you're using ITSM, incident problem change, you're probably going to have somebody from the help desk, or if you've got those processes more formalized, capability owners, you might have an incident process manager, a problem process manager, et cetera.
Yeah, and that's one of the areas where it's harder to, I guess, be prescriptive of what that should be, because organizations are different size, they're structured differently. So I think when we talk about it, we can talk about roles, but not necessarily how that's going to translate into a particular organization. But I think you hit on one of them. You need process owners. I think you also need to counterbalance that with representatives of the users as well, so that you can, make sure you're not implementing processes that have negative impact on the end users, that they need to have a voice as well.
Right. You need those end users to buy into the tool, use the tool to make it your return on investment, show up. I think one of the other things that you need to plan when you're approaching it is your development capacity. If you have all of these applications and all of these stakeholders coming in, but you have 1 or 2 developers, your funnel gets really tiny. And so you need to make sure that you need to make sure that you have that, you know what your development capacity is, so the stakeholders come in knowing what they're going to get out of it, or how fast things are going to move.
They need to know if you've got a 19-year backlog, and
but that's somewhere a framework like that, the agile project management comes in, right? You sort of size your period of time, right? How much development bandwidth you have, and you're sizing the things you're doing, and you can project out how long things will take.
Yeah, and I think projecting out is probably one of the important things too, so that people requesting enhancements or new features, things like that, have an understanding of how long it's going to take. It may not be ideal, but it's better off that they're knowing than waiting for an answer without that.
Right, because if they're left in the dark, that's when they move into another tool or another instance, and you end up now having multiple tools doing the same thing.
I think one of the other important things to consider when you're planning for platform governance is what should and shouldn't go through the governance process. So I had mentioned earlier that we don't want to send everything through. I think there's a need to be able to send, small changes. I think, Sabrina, you mentioned group name changes or, data changes, things like that. Those are going to come up. Those are kind of no-brainers that you just send on to the team, as long as they're following your guidelines for naming, things like that. Just pass it through. Don't, weigh down the committee. You can kind of look at it similar to a change advisory board, and what would you send through CAB versus, what would you set up as a standard change?
Yeah, and I think so. So that you have the obvious one, right? And then you've got so that's the obvious not to include, right? The group name changes, and you've got the obvious things to include, like bringing on a new app onto ServiceNow. Then there's things in the middle that most organizations don't need to talk about. What happens if somebody who owns the service catalog item for requesting a new cell phone wants an update, right? Do we send that through? Probably not, right? It's limited impact. So some guidance. I guess the part of the approach, or part of the planning for platform governance is forming guidance on what needs governed.
Now, we did have a comment from one of our attendees right now, who said, what about federated development? And Susan, if you need me to, Josh, those planes, man, you guys are on the airport. Susan, if you need me to clarify your question a little bit more as I explain it, feel free to type it in. But what about federated development, where platform governance equals DevOps best practices, SDLC, upgrades, patches, architecture design, and product managers equal product roadmaps, business use cases, et cetera, where process owners equal centralization. How do you handle that in a cohesive governance structure?
So a process owner in your scenario, right, could be a product manager, right? It doesn't have to be the person that owns the process across the organization. It could be, we're building an application in ServiceNow, and there's somebody who's the product manager there, or the business sponsor, right, the stakeholder. So the same thing occurs to some degree. You do want to have a good view at a platform level. What is the working queue, even if it is across different teams. And then for each team, and generally, how are we prioritizing that? Because typically, as you start to talk about patches and stuff and releases, it is going to have a platform-wide impact. Now that may be shifting a little bit as we move along here. ServiceNow has announced some changes in how they're deploying releases, but for now, even if we have 7 or 8 work streams across different parts of the platform, they're all going to be impacted by some of these types of things that we have to keep our eye on.
Yeah, and I'd say it's kind of shifting the scope of responsibility for these people up a couple of levels. So rather than an incident and a problem and a change process owner, you could shift that up to be ITSM and HR and facilities and things like that, where they've got broader areas of responsibility for the decisions that they're making. They can obviously take input from lower level process owners prior to coming into any sort of governance planning sessions or reviews. But bringing that level up so that you're not building a governance committee that's 50 people. You want to keep it small enough that you can move discussions through and have those people empowered to make decisions.
Yep.
Yeah, that's how she described it. She said that right now they have domain owners, who are in charge of the specific areas like ITSM, HR, SecOps, etc.
Yep.
Engage the platform owner on a larger global impact, such as upgrades and patching and cloning.
Yep.
Okay, awesome. Thanks, Susan. So guys, I think one of the things that we talked about before, before this live session is how for organizations, it's, every organization is unique, right? I think we put on one of our social media posts, how is platform governance like parenting? And it's, I think the idea that there's really no handbook for it, right? There's no one right way to do it because every organization is unique. How do you think an organization can identify their unique requirements and sort of plan around those?
And do they all have an invisible kid to yell at, or?
Yeah.
I'm sure they do.
Organizations mocking your video games at 7 a.m.
There's always somebody in an organization that it's not their fault. Not me. Not me.
I think that's probably true too. But no, I guess, there's no, every organization can't just plug this process. There's no one template that every organization is going to be able to just, insert their own information and then have a perfect plan, right? So what are some of those unique areas to look out for, for example, you can't identify all of them, and how do you plan around those?
So I think going back to John's point, right, it is important to start first with who has a stake, right? Who are the stakeholders? So, I think you have somebody who has to speak for the platform, and then if you start early on, ideally, right, you have less on the platform, so you can identify the people that speak for incident or ITSM or ITOM, right, whatever it is, and get those people involved. And from there, it's just, I think, starting with governing incoming work, right? How do we prioritize things to make sure the things that are most important to the business are done first? And the drivers for that can come from different sources, right? It could come from industry compliance. It could come from other stuff, right? But there's a lot of different ways work funnels in and a lot of different things that helps you prioritize that. But I think the very, very first focus for a governance team is who is on it that can speak for the various parts of the platform we're using or may start using, and how do we prioritize and make sure things are done in the right order.
I would also say look for somebody that can speak outside of the platform as well. So an enterprise architect, somebody like that who can, help as you're deciding whether new functionality should come into ServiceNow. Do you already have applications for that? Is ServiceNow better than that, and the old one should be retired, or vice versa? Somebody that also has visibility into enterprise best practices. They may have visibility into security and governance concerns for the organization as well. So somebody that knows the larger larger enterprise vision is helpful, so you're not staying completely ServiceNow focused with it.
Now, Josh, you brought up about prioritizing in terms of planning ahead. Now, obviously, ServiceNow does a lot of different things, and many companies now are not just using it for IT anymore, right? They're using it for HR and for security and for finance. How do you suggest people prioritize that? I mean, that's probably, when you mentioned how that's a unique identifier for them, how do they do that? How do they prioritize which of those different modules and features of ServiceNow to really roll out?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, let's say, so you mentioned that we've moved beyond IT. So let's say that we have an organization that, has your basic ITSM, so instant problem change request, and then they also have, or have recently implemented like HR case. So on their, in their stakeholders, they probably have the enterprise architect, like John mentioned. They probably have a platform owner, potentially a platform architect. And then they have somebody to speak for all of ITSM or the various components, as well as somebody to speak for HR case, and then ideally somebody who can sort of speak to the user experience to some degree. And I think what you do is you sit down there and it's almost like a change approval board, right? Where everyone, if they have something that they want, right? So I'm the HR resource that's speaking for HR case. I'm gonna say, hey, I really want these changes to support GDPR. And when John, the enterprise architect, goes, well, yeah, but we're trying to do these other things right now. I might say, well, look, guys, we have this onus on us from new GDPR constraints that are coming into play. We have to do this, or our business is going to be in a lot of trouble, right? So it's this process where we talk through the things that are incenting us to make the change, and then come to a consensus. And I think what people get scared because they think that somebody who owns ITSM is going to be like, no, do mine, and somebody who owns HR is going to be like, no, do mine. But my experience is organizations tend to turn out pretty good because, when you talk through it, it's easier to understand what's going on. And I think then what happens is, if my ITSM process owner says, man, that stinks, the thing that I wanted isn't going to be available for a couple months because we're focused on GDPR, at least instead of just getting told no, they were part of the conversation and they understand from a business perspective why that's been delayed. So, part of the governance and planning, or one of the results I would say is everybody feels more included in the conversation, and people have more visibility into what's going on and where their stuff falls and why.
And I would say one of the important ways of deciding what you should work on, you should really be building and maintaining a roadmap as well. So don't just think of things as requested enhancement requests, upgrades, maintenance, things like that, but also be planful and maybe once or twice a year hold a roadmap session and review so that you can plan out those larger initiatives that you want to implement and have a timeline for what that's going to look like. And those can be shifted around based on business priority, user readiness, things like that can be evaluated. And that may help some of those discussions when everybody can see the big picture, and as a group you can kind of plan which ones you're taking on when, so you're not trying to do 10 major initiatives all at the same time. You're more planful and doing one or two at a time, and everybody knows where to stand.
So that's a really good point. I think if we end up in a position where every governance meeting, let's say they're monthly, we're starting with a blank slate for what's next month, we're doing it wrong, right? There are some things that that should be in a longer roadmap. You know, we know when releases are coming out. We know to some degree when patches are coming out. We know when, you know, other software is expiring at the company and we might be moving off 6 months from now onto ServiceNow, right? Some of these big things we should have mapped out.
Mm-hmm. Now, real quick, I want to, you know, still save some time for us to kind of walk through that process that John was bringing up about being planful and kind of developing a plan, like a roadmap for how to approach, you know, what you're going to be doing with the platform. But one thing I want to just kind of revisit real quickly before we do that, we kind of touched on the idea of who to bring into this. But I don't know that we really kind of identified the hazards of having the wrong team on a platform governance plan, because they are one of the most common expressions about platform governance is that there's too many chefs, right? Is that there's just too many people involved in the process who are able to manipulate things beyond what is coordinated for everybody, right? But beyond a way that works for everybody. And if everyone's doing their own thing, it can kind of mess everything up. How do you identify whether, number one, if you've had too many chefs in your kitchen, and two, how do you whittle that down to the right people in the room?
So I think you look at it as, go ahead, Sabrina.
I was going to say, I think the first step is if you've already got the people in the room and you're not getting anything through governance, and it's a constant conflict and battle, and there's very little that's flowing out of those meetings, that's the first indicator. I think that you've got too many chefs in the kitchen.
Yeah, additionally, I think if you're, and this is sort of the same thing, right, but it's you perceive it differently, right? If you have business leaders from HR or other parts of the organization who are expressing frustration about their stuff not getting done, you know, that might happen anyway. But if you're getting a lot of that, it's a good opportunity to look and say, well, maybe they don't have the right voice, or maybe you know, there's somebody else who's sort of monopolizing the backlog, so to speak.
And the balance may be off.
Yep.
So look for the appropriate balance. I'd also say you may have people that get too far down into the weeds or too technical. So I've seen it if you're inviting too many of the ServiceNow developers, you know, we're pretty good at sidetracking ourselves into discussion that probably doesn't need to happen in that type of forum. So just make sure that the representation from your ServiceNow development or support team is somebody who's able to kind of think at that higher level and represent the team without, you know, needing every person from the team involved.
Yeah, and I think perspective is important too, right? I think we, you know, and IT departments are doing this more and more in general, right? We want to treat it as a service that the ServiceNow team is providing to the business. So, you know, when I would attend a meeting like that, right, as a ServiceNow representative, I'm sitting there almost like a customer service representative, right, helping guide the discussion, helping provide helpful information. But at the end of the day, my customers get to decide what they want. And there's some constraints to that, obviously, right? There's things that are objectively bad ideas based on what we know about the platform or whatever, and we might help guide that discussion. But I think if you remember that, you know, you're providing a service and you're helping the consumption of that service be more pleasant, you can really sort of set the right tone for the conversation.
Sure. Well, let's do this then right now. If you guys are ready to kind of take this conversation to the next level right now, let's try to whiteboard it a little bit. Now, as I mentioned, this is not a spontaneous whiteboarding. We do have something prepared that is an example, not a template for every company, but definitely a good example of what you guys can be doing in the planning process for yourselves. Oh, hold on. Can you guys still see?
Yep.
The screen? All right, I think I'm back. So John, go ahead. I believe you have control of the screen right now.
Yeah. So full transparency, we did try to make this whiteboarding. I absolutely cannot draw with a finger and a trackpad, so I had to prepare this. But you know, Josh, Sabrina, Tim, feel free to kind of jump in and let's have a conversation while we go through this. So really,
Oh, hold on. Let me see if it's maybe on my end.
There we go. All right. So talking about the governance committee, start out by talking about who these roles are that need to be involved. And I think, it's important to think about what the role is, not necessarily who the person is, because one person could play multiple roles in this based on the size of your organization. The first and most obvious one is you need your platform owner there. They're going to be the leader and the driver of the governance committee, making sure that the meetings are happening, that the process is running, and that you're getting the outcomes that you need to continue driving the platform forward. And then, as I think I just mentioned, you also need somebody who can play the platform architect role, or really be the voice of the ServiceNow team. So, not just your developer, but somebody more at an architect level, or somebody who can play that role that, can be the voice of supporting ServiceNow and developing ServiceNow, knows the new features that are coming, the releases as they're coming out, what those features are, et cetera. And then we've got the enterprise architect who can play the voice of technology role. So how does the rest of the organization look? What else is going on at the enterprise level, technology-wise? They're going to have insight into other applications that you have in the environment, whether you've already got something for that capability, and discussions need to be had about replacing or retiring, things like that. And then you've got the process owners, or the voice of process. This is going to vary based on what you have in your environment, and I think we've already discussed this a little bit. So, maybe if you're just implementing ITSM, you may have it split out across incident and problem and change. However, as you grow and implement other application suites, you might roll that up a level to ITSM, HR, facilities, and have it up at that level. And the idea is there is you want somebody that can be the voice of how that process needs to work, and be able to have the discussions of how that might interact with the other processes. And
and a quick point on that. I think just to be clear, we're not necessarily saying like the business analyst, who helps drive the incident process, or the major incident process. We're really talking about the person that's accountable to the organization for the incident experience. So part of that is process, part of that is usability, all those types of things. And typically that's a manager who might be, for incident, they might be somewhat involved with the help desk, right? Or they might have control over that, and they might take input from users who interact with self-service, and try to just balance everything and make that capability work for the organization. If you look at just the sort of the person who's designing the process, I think it can be, you forget the user experience part of it to some degree.
I think you want somebody that's forward-looking with it too, of what can be, not just what you have or what may be broken. And exactly to what you were saying, Josh, I think you've also got the counterbalance of the user champions, and those need to match the same breakdown that you have for the process owners. So if you have an HR process owner, you should have a champion of the users as well, and be able to provide that voice of HR customer users as well. And I think having them both on the committee, I think you're going to start to see relationships built between those process owners and user champions as well.
So it's kind of like the customer versus provider, right? You might have the guy that manages the help desk, and then somebody on the business side that is a frequent user or something like that.
Right. So you may have HR self-service portal that the process owner is pushing, and the user champion may know their users really well and say, our users really aren't comfortable with that type of technology yet. They really do prefer more of a legacy phone-based model. They're not ready for it, which can drive a decision of, either you want to move it forward and it's going to take some organizational change, or you may delay that while you try to work on the users to ready them for certain types of change. And then finally, the final role that I think you need is somebody like a ServiceNow platform business analyst, but really the role they're playing is the gatekeeper of what needs to go to governance, what doesn't, et cetera.
That's where a lot of companies fall down, is they take that role out, I think.
Yep. And I think they also add in the ServiceNow development team into it as well. So I have them kind of below all of this, just showing that they're going to take the output of this process, but they're not necessarily in the process. And then as far as the intake queue comes, that can come from a bunch of different places. You can have enhancement requests. You can have projects that are spun up that you know about. Fixes, maintenance, such as upgrades, all of those things get taken into the intake queue. Looks like Susan brought up the idea that they use IDEA and demand management and PPM to manage this. That's a great portion of the ServiceNow tool that can handle some of this to serve as an intake and prioritization as it goes through the process. But really, it's first going to go to the gatekeeper for an initial check. So they'd be the ones that are reviewing what it is that's coming through here. And they may decide, no, this is absolutely not a good fit for ServiceNow. Maybe we already have something like this and users weren't aware of it. So they can kind of serve as an initial deflection so that everybody else doesn't need to be inundated with requests that may not make sense. They're also going to be able to identify those minor changes or enhancements or must-do fixes, incident, break fix, and things like that can just go straight over to the ServiceNow development team. And then they're also going to be building the queue of what needs reviewing and needs to be sent to the governance committee for decisions. So the process that they're going to go through, it's got to go through a review process, take a look at the new things that are coming in and make decisions on fit and purpose and whether it's going to make sense to bring that into ServiceNow. Provide some sort of approval and or rejection process to send it back through for more information. And then it needs to go through a prioritization process. As we stated, that's got to balance your intake queue along with your known roadmap so that you're taking it all into account to make sure that you're prioritizing it. When you're looking at how to prioritize things, it's best not to try to plan everything for the next 18 months. That's too much. You should really be looking at what are we going to be doing right now in this current release? What are we going to be doing in the next release? So kind of release and release plus one, and then put everything else into an everything else bucket as far as the backlog goes, so that you're really being more up to date with the backlog planning. So you're not planning so far out that when it comes time to do it, it's no longer relevant. And the end result is a prioritized backlog that your ServiceNow development team has to work off of. I think after this, we're jumping to another slide. Anybody?
So how does, quick question, John. So I like your right now, next, everything else, right? How do we fit in things that we talked about earlier that are on the roadmap that we know are coming, right? So. Yep.
So they're still on the roadmap is kind of the idea that they can go into the backlog just as a placeholder, but you don't need to pull those into planned releases until they're getting closer, because what's going to fit into those releases may not make sense.
So until they're next, we know they're coming, but we're not really worrying about them, is what you're saying.
You have the roadmap to show this is kind of where it's planned to come, but you're not going to go through the detailed level of planning until later.
Got it.
All right, so kind of diving into that, how does the roadmap that you have and the intake queue work into a backlog? So I think you're kind of segueing into the conversation here a little bit. Your backlog is really going to come from both parts. You're going to pull pieces from the roadmap as they're getting close and time to implement. And then you're going to go through your review process to also pull things from the intake queue that makes sense. Within your backlog, within a particular development cycle, you're going to pull in things to fill yourself up to capacity as much as it makes sense. With the roadmap planning, you want to be careful that you're not trying to take on all of your large projects at once. You're picking one or two of those to work on at any time, so you're not crossing focus on that too much, and you can really put the focused effort that may be needed to implement new functionality or major release with one of your existing applications. But you also want to fill that in with kind of the medium-sized stuff and a bunch of the small stuff, so that the people who are requesting or affected by these changes can see continuous value being added and not feel like they're waiting for every major thing to be done before you start on their changes, and processes are continually improving. However, the development cycle capacity does not necessarily mean that's how you should release it. So just because I'm working on these two major things at once doesn't mean I should be releasing them alongside each other. General recommendation would be to focus on, one major release of functionality at a time, or mixed releases that have smaller bits and pieces that can be released together. Usually that's a more of a cyclical release type scenario, a monthly, quarterly release, something like that, where you're bundling changes together and releasing them as well. Whereas your large initiatives probably release more on an event-based schedule, where the functionality is done, you've communicated out to the end users, gone through training, etc.
And this doesn't just have to be linear, right? In our example with federated development, we could have a couple parallel development cycles with releases that are asynchronous, right? That are in parallel.
Yeah.
So, we could have a team working on some additional discovery patterns for ITOM and event management, a team working on ITSM or catalog items, right? And service portal, and those things can be stacked up side by side. This is just sort of one look at a input for one part of the platform, or more, depending on how your team's built.
Just looking at all the circles and boxes, and if I did try to draw this, it probably would have been quite comical.
I mean, it looks kind of like a cell culture.
Yeah.
So, John, I know that you've talked before about planning capacity by identifying the projects as, and I don't know if this is the exact phrase you put, but something like pebbles, rocks, and boulders, right? I mean, this looks like what you're referring to there in terms of when you're planning it out, just identifying where that capacity is. What do you do when you get to the point where your entire bucket is full of pebbles? That still sounds to me more arduous than having two big boulders in it for some reason. Does that capacity plan kind of have to modify that, or how do you approach that?
If that's all that you've got, you may have your capacity reduced slightly by the number of things that you can put out there, but it's probably more just in the amount of ancillary testing that needs to happen because of the unknown impacts that those small changes may make. But you can do a lot of kind of small, quick changes in a single development cycle. Usually what happens, though, is the ability for users to absorb that much change. So you've got to still be thoughtful about who are those changes going out to, and then it becomes not just the development cycle capacity, but the organizational capacity. That the users need to be able to accept that much change coming out of your development, so don't develop for development's sake.
Sure. So don't fill up your bucket just because there's space in it. Make sure that you're prioritizing what's essential.
Yeah, I know. Sabrina and I, having worked together before, seen it at a customer where, they would end up doing release by process, because then they could kind of communicate what could fit into that process. And it wasn't always just, how much could the developers do, but it was what made sense for the customers to absorb. So it really takes a large amount of stuff like this, or a bunch of rocks and sand, but condenses it down into a single boulder worth of process changes.
That makes sense. All right, well, great. Hey, guys, we're a little bit, I think we're about 5 minutes past the 45-minute mark on this. But if anyone has any more questions right now, we're still free. We've got time. We'll take your questions if you would like to throw anything else into the chat box here. Otherwise, if we don't hear, I'm seeing something come in. Just want to double check. Oh, just a thank you. All right, thank you guys as well. Yeah, if you guys want more information from Cerna Solutions, or if you want to have a conversation like this with your team about some projects you guys have coming up, definitely go to cernasolutions.com or contact us at the information here on the screen. If you want to hear more webinars or podcasts like this, you can go to our website as well and click on the resources tab, or look us up on YouTube. We're there. We've been doing these sessions for quite a long time, and we have a good wealth of information there. You guys can subscribe and hit the bell if you want to be notified when we have this type of content out there again. Otherwise, everyone have a great day. Thank you to our panelists, John, Sabrina, and Josh. We really appreciate the conversation today.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, Tim.
All right, guys. Have a great day. We'll see you guys next time.